Well, thank you, and it's great to be here and great to be hearing a variety of discussions of the symbolic and practical intersection of food and food symbolism. This, what I will be presenting today is part of a paper that I co-wrote with Fred Tappenden at McGill in Montreal. And it arose out of a series of seminars at the Canadian Society for Biblical Studies annual meetings, looking at the issue of media, forms of communication in the ancient world, and the impact of that upon religion. And so I thought, what if we looked at the issue of food as media, food as a communicative device? What would that, what insights, what questions would that yield? And it was a rich topic to look at. Fred had the task, and I co-wrote with him the theoretical basis. So while I will only speak briefly about the theoretical basis, because as a historian I like to get to the primary data and engage that. And in particular, I will speak at some length about issues in the Greco-Roman world, since we have a couple of classicists here. But I'll mention some of the other things as well. In the theoretical underpinnings of this work, we look at cognitive linguistics, Lakoff and Johnson. And to summarize their theory briefly, they propose that embodiment, a common experience of bodily processes, will naturally lead to a pan-cultural phenomenon of mapping bodily experiences onto similarly perceived abstracts. So here, learning naturally maps onto the consumption of food. You're taking something external, you're internalizing it, you're processing it, hopefully you're nourished, or it assists in your growth. And so there's I think a natural pairing or combination of all of those issues. To that, we also added the work of the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, and his proposal was that ritual can be a teaching device. In other words, not only does ritual express abstract or cognitive issues, ritual can help shape them. Ritual can help understand them in somewhat of a process that I suppose we could also call socialization. So a group going through the rituals that constitute the group will learn what group membership means, will learn what group identity means. And so these two fields were brought together in the theory. Now I'll read a couple of portions from the paper that we wrote. So, food for thought, bread as both consumptive and communicative medium. Bread illustrates the combination of the physical and the conceptual, the individual and group that we have explored above. While bread may be consumed either privately or communally, others have grown the grain, processed it into flour, transported the flour to market, provided recipes, and constructed implements to process and bake the item. Bread, like any foodstuff, is thoroughly social, and it is also cultural. The consumption of bread, especially in ceremonies which speak to and maintain group identity, is a rich topic to explore. Before turning to the evidence assembled relating to the motif of bread and its consumption, we want to introduce 2 points that have emerged from the analysis. First, we found that many of the accounts of the Bible, in the Bible of bread and its consumption, partake of the motif, the banquet of the host. Lavish meals given by a host were common in the ancient world. including Persian banquets and the Greco-Roman Symposium. What are the features of this motif? Through participation in the meal, consumption of bread in its broadest sense, the guests learn two things. First, they learn relationship to the host. He provides the food. They accept the food. He nourishes them. They are nourished. He gives to them generously. They are in a state of dependence upon him. The paradigm of a generous host is one who provides generously to his guests at a meal. For example, Abraham in Genesis 18, the father in Jesus' parable about the wayward son, Luke 15. In the meal, the people also learn community with the other guests at the banquet. Those at the meal are united as being guests of the host. They experience and thus learn answer to the question, what do we have in common? What unites us as a group? This paradigm is echoed in various meals in the Jewish, early Christian, and Greco-Roman polytheist groups. The institution of Passover illustrates the issue of community and leadership roles being created and affirmed. Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, certainly partakes of this motif, and the banquet motif also applies to the Roman emperor, particularly when he is distributing bread for the masses, and especially when loaves were distributed with his image on it. A second and related point is as follows. Many bread accounts in the ancient world are not only connected through the central motif, banquet of the host, but also through the specific motif of the worship meal of the community, which itself had been shaped by the overarching banquet motif. For Jewish people, the worship meal was Passover. So in other episodes in Hebrew Scripture, banquet narratives or discussions of bread link to the archetypal event of Passover and comment on it and expand its theme. One thing demonstrated in the paper is that the Exodus narrative of manna in the wilderness anticipates Passover, and that the theme of wisdom's feast in the wisdom literature is tacitly portrayed as a higher level Passover, this time not for all, only those specially invited to the feast and able to receive wisdom. Similarly, New Testament accounts of Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples provide an archetype which links together many other New Testament accounts of bread, meal, and encounters with Jesus. Certainly the episodes of the followers who encounter the risen Christ on the road to Emmaus, Paul taking bread after his life-altering experience, or John's discussion of Jesus as bread of life indicate a connection to this Eucharistic archetype. So, I will only speak briefly, although it's a fascinating topic, to consider the centrality of Passover as a Jewish identity marker, how it participates in this host and community learning experience, and the rabbis and in also biblical accounts link explicitly Passover with learning. And that's a fascinating topic, which I will only mention here. The account of manna from heaven clearly echoes or anticipates or is a foreshadowing of what Passover will be. For example, Exodus 16 suggests that manna will help the Israelites know Yahweh by observing his acts of deliverance, and it will help them see the glory of Yahweh. In other words, they will learn to know about the host of the banquet, the supplier of the feast in the wilderness. The fact that manna is depicted as a new and unique substance gives it a mysterious aspect. In other words, it's not immediately known. It has to be learned as to what it is. And as they learn what it is, they learn who Yahweh is. They need to ask, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. And this is an etymological explanation of manna in Hebrew. Deuteronomy 8 makes this point explicit. He humbled you, Yahweh, humbled you and let you hunger, and then fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but that man lives by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. And of course, Jesus himself cites this passage later, probably in a commentary in the mind of early Christians on the Eucharist. Wisdom's feast, turning to that, linked to Passover, linked to the consumption of bread. Lady Wisdom in Proverbs said, "Come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine that I have mixed." So once again, the host provides a special food for his community or her community through the consumption of this meal, symbolized and enacted. Learning takes place. Early Christianity, again, just very briefly, the central archetypal event of Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples, which itself is linked to Passover, and that's another dimension, sort of that aspect, but then is echoed in a variety of ways in liturgical bread and discussions of bread in early Christianity. A couple of points that I'll bring in that which may be less known. The Didache, early church manual of the 2nd century, gives a very interesting Eucharistic prayer. As this broken bread was scattered upon the mountains, but then brought together and became one, so let thy church, ecclesia, be gathered together from the ends of the earth into thy kingdom. So clearly seeing a learning principle at stake in the consumption of bread. In the 5th century, we have evidence of Eucharistic practice in Rome, a really interesting idea. Loaves were blessed by the bishop and then distributed out to all of the neighborhood churches under his jurisdiction, thus creating a common bread being distributed, sort of the reverse of what the Didache was speaking of. But all the people who are consuming this bread know that the bishop has blessed it. As they consume it, they feel united under his leadership, and they feel united in their community. Also, we have evidence of the physical form and the stylization of bread. Bread stamps were adapted from the Greco-Roman world and used specifically among early Christian groups. We have evidence of a cross motif or a chi symbol being stamped on the bread. At times, bread would be stamped with the word phos, light, or zoe, life, and the people are ingesting these materials and learning about central Christian tenets. Now I'll read another section relating to the classical world. The word bread had a particular connotation in ancient Greece because bread was a basic foodstuff and one of the key ingredients of a meal. Greeks assumed that bread was the staple diet of humans. For Greeks, the essence of human civilization, and therefore humanity, was epitomized in the act of baking and preparing food. The Greek idiom, "those who eat bread," indicated human beings as opposed to animals or gods. Both Homer and Hesiod use this phrase. When Odysseus is on the island of the Cyclops, he comments upon the barbarous inhuman nature of the giant Polyphemos, saying he has no place among those who eat bread. Hesiod talks about the Bronze Age of humanity, which seems, those ancient people seem superficially like us, but they were not like us because they did not eat bread, works and days. Plutarch says that the virtues of the simple life, devoted to reason, are taught in eating plain bread with cheese and cress, and finding satisfaction in that simple food. Xenophon similarly notes that the Persians taught their boys self-control by limiting their diet to simple bread, cress for relish, and water. Juvenal shows that the status of guests at a banquet was symbolized and enacted in the quality of bread offered to them. The higher the status of the guests, the finer and whiter the loaf. Satire 5. As was mentioned previously, it's likely that early Christian practices concerning the liturgical use of bread had antecedents in the Greco-Roman world. And a fascinating book by a scholar named Galvanus gives evidence of this. What may be one of the oldest surviving bread stamps or bread molds has on it the image of a temple. So clearly indicating a sacral quality to this bread, or a blessed quality. Bread was a common food item distributed at religious festivals, and as such it would often be decorated with symbols relating to the myth or the account of the particular god, who was seen as the host of the feast in her or his name. I think we should not limit our consideration of this issue to this bread being decorated with these motifs. I think we should consider the possibility that bread would be used as part of a process of learning and a statement of group identity. The same thing was seen in the communal meals of Judaism and Christianity, so why not in the Greek and the Roman religious meals? For example, we know that in festivals to Adonis, cakes were made in the form of flowers, birds, or animals. These are typical motifs associated with that deity, who was associated with spring and renewal. For Isis and Osiris, cakes were made in the shape of animals that had figured in the myth of Osiris. People would learn about and participate in the myth by eating the bread. For Demeter and Persephone, especially during the Eleusinian mysteries, cakes were baked or shaped in the image of torches, dogs, omphaloi, the sacred site or the sacred navel, flowers. These are all elements of the central myth. For Artemis, associated with the hunt, festival bread was called the deer, and this may have either had a distinctive shape or stamp on it. Women's festivals in Laconia and also the Thesmophoria in Sicily had bread in the shape of women's breasts or genitalia, speaking to female identity. Some bread stamps featured a bullhead and a rooster. Those were stock Greco-Roman symbols of piety and public sacrifice. The practice of decorating bread at festivals was adapted by rulers in administering the ruler cult. Thus, bread with the ruler's image would be distributed during festivals celebrating the ruler's birthday, an apt way for citizens to internalize under whose rule they lived. The foodstuff itself is a reminder of the emperor as host and provider of life's necessities. And by the way, there is astonishingly little recognition in Christian studies of the impact of this bread stamping on the Eucharistic wafer. It seems very obvious to me. I'll toss in one other thing. A most intriguing account from Pausanias, who describes an oracular site in a cave. This is not unusual. Chthonic elements are typically conducted within caves. However, Pausanias describes the chamber as being shaped like a bread oven, and that the person seeking the oracle descended into the abyss carrying barley cakes. So the person goes and is baking in the oven. As he incubates there, he has food, bread surrounding him, and he emerges with the content of his dream or vision. Thus, says Pausanias, he would learn the future. So, in conclusion, You cram these words into my ears and against the stomach of my sense. Shakespeare, The Tempest. Why does this, what seems to be mixed metaphor, work? Why is it striking? It suggests that the really significant aspects of life are complex. They bring together opposites and a creative tension. I hope that the research that I've presented suggests some intriguing issues, and in particular the following. The significant aspects of life are embodied, not just conceptual, social, not just individual, and a process, not just a moment. Thanks.